And it is a crisis. And I think it's very much akin to the crisis that we saw, well, our grandparents saw in 1929. You've got the initial crash where everybody throws their toys out of a pram. We all get terribly worried. Banks start worrying about the value of the collateral they've got against loans, all that sort of stuff. The Fed comes in, has to rescue the situation. Calm is restored for a number of months, and then the real decline starts, and it's very pernicious.
This is Kaiser Johnson with Liberty and Finance, and these are the Miles Franklin weekly specials for August 5th through August 12th, 2024, while supplies last. First, we feature 2024 1-ounce silver American Eagles at $5.50 over spot. Next, we have backdated 1-ounce silver Austrian Philharmonics at just $3.10 over spot. We also have Dealer's Choice Constitutional Silver half dollars at $2.50 over spot per ounce. Next, backdated 1-ounce gold American Buffalo are just $99 over spot. And finally, we have a limited quantity of 1-ounce silver full-color Trump Fight for America bars, just $6 over spot. They come 20 a sheet, and so have a minimum order of 20 and are sold in multiples of 20. To order our specials or any of the many other options we have available, call us at 1-888-81-LIBERTY. That's 1-888-815-4237. We're available after hours and on weekends, and we look forward to speaking with you.
Welcome back to Liberty and Finance. We're always privileged to have this distinguished returning guest, Alasdair Macleod, a former bank director, also the head of research at goldmoney.com, and with his own Substack, which we'll talk about at the end, joins us again today, Tuesday. This is August 6th, 2024. Alasdair, thank you for coming back on Liberty and Finance.
That's my pleasure.
We often rely on you to give us insight into strains in the banking sector and in global markets. We've certainly seen a lot of volatility in global markets over the past week. Japan and the yen and the U.S. stock indices and the foreign indices and gold and silver. We'll get into that in just a moment. First, I wanted to give you a chance to give us a boots-on-the-ground report of what is being reported in the U.S. press as UK is burning, talking about rampant, unrest and demonstrations and riots and protests going on there. And if you could give us kind of your sense from the ground of how serious this is and what you think it signifies, and whether you see this as start of a trend, and whether you think it will have implications outside the UK as well.
Well, I think to put it in context, I'd like to tell a little story about my own childhood, if you like, because I was born and brought up in Kenya during the Mau Mau. Now, I vividly remember that there was a farm where two elderly people were murdered brutally by the Mau Mau. And this was reported in the press back in the UK. I mean, it was headlines, and you'd think the whole country was in insurrection, and this was, you're really terrible. But actually, at the end of the Mau Mau, I think a number like 64 Europeans had been murdered, whereas some 4,000 or 5,000 Africans had been murdered and tortured by the Mau Mau. So to put this into context, when you read something in the press, you think this is, this is absolute, terrible, widespread, et cetera. It's not actually widespread. We've got clashes, discontent, if you like, with all the immigration, and this is something that you'll be aware of in America as well. Growing discontent about immigrants taking jobs and all the rest of it, and of course, this centers in some of the cities which have a lot of these immigrants. I think the other aspect of it is that with a Labour government, they are trying to deflect the, if you like, the whole story into this is a right-wing conspiracy. These are, far-right Nazi thugs and all the rest of it. Now, I'm sure there is an element of that, but there is absolutely no criticism of the other side at all. The reporting, if you like, from the government side, which mainstream media follows generally, is actually very, very unbalanced. But generally, I would say that unlike some of the continental countries, particularly France, and believe it or not, Germany, that sort of violence we don't really have in this country. You may get pockets of it. And in the past, I remember there were riots in Brixton, for example, and that was during 1980s. So these things do happen, but I think it would be wrong to read too much into it. And I was sort of slightly perplexed to see that some countries, like the UAR, I think was one mentioned, that has given a chance, sort of an advisory to their citizens: don't travel to the UK if you have to. I mean, this is just complete nonsense. So, move along, nothing to see, I think is probably it. But the underlying thing, I think the underlying theme to this is that anyone who is not a left-wing socialist is liable to be accused by the current government of being right-wing and therefore undermining the status quo. Now, that's a big, big difference from anything we have seen before. I think that's the important point, which is worth registering. But in terms of riots, it's a nothing burger, really.
Certainly for those directly impacted by it, it's not nothing. But what you're talking about, I think, is the broad societal or economic impact, that sort of thing. It may be over-focused from the reporting on it, and certainly lopsided reporting. It's remarkable when you try to search this story using typical major search engines in the U.S. You get what appears to be a very curated and one-sided presentation of the narrative about that. I completely concur with that. And it seems to be something that we've observed with distressingly increasing frequency when major conflicts of any type arise, is that you only get presented basically one side of the story. And that seems, from my engineering and scientific background, a quick tip-off that you're not getting the whole truth if you're only getting one viewpoint. So that's concerning, because it pushes back the curtain of the lie that we've been fed about information democracy and that sort of thing with the internet, and realizing that there are forces who are hidden behind the curtain who are controlling what we're allowed to read, and therefore what we're allowed to discuss and what we're allowed to think. And that's probably as distressing as the original topic of concern in the first place.
It's Orwellian, if you like. And I'm very, very definitely. And I would support the point you made, really, to save any confusion whatsoever. Any writing like this is extremely unpleasant for anyone who's caught up in it. And so you're absolutely right to point out that really what I'm doing is I'm looking at it, if you like, very much from a top-down point of view, from a broader political and social point of view, and the way things are developing. And I would also add that, there's been rioting in France under President Macron for 2-3 years, just continual. And you could argue that the reason the press don't report on it is that nobody's interested in it. But, it has been pretty much continual. Different lots rioting, admittedly, whether it's the farmers or people complaining about, sort of petrol taxes, or whether it's, trying to raise the pension age and all the rest, all this sort of stuff. It has been really very, very difficult in France. These are difficulties we don't tend to see here. So perhaps when we do get just a touch of it, it is a bit overemphasized.
Well, I think then it's worth mentioning as you talk about increasing compared to a historic baseline, increasing evidence that the new normal is higher tensions, higher unrest, more disrupted lives, and people complaining about it and feeling that they need to take action of some kind to speak out and act out because things aren't working out for them in their lives. And I think that may be a part of a mega trend, not just in France and not just in the UK and in the US and everywhere else, where the system is breaking down, and the people who are being ground between the millstones, the middle class and the lower class, are feeling it. And while we're getting the official news from on high that, oh, the economy is strong, and oh, it's all going to be just fine, and we've got everything under control, and trust the authorities, the ordinary people are increasingly feeling strained. And it seems from a lot of the topics that we've talked about, the trend is not our friend in this regard, is that the fundamental trends that are firmly in place as far as rapid exponential expansion of debt and destruction of the purchasing power of the currency, which you've talked about for years with us, strains on employment, strains on the banking system, et cetera, strains on home ownership costs, et cetera, are only likely to increase going forward. And therefore, unrest may continue to ramp up.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And I think another point which is worth mentioning, I think, while we're on this topic, I do see that there is going to be enormous clamping down on social media in this country. So anyone, again, expressing a non-socialist view, I think is likely to find that they're either ostracized by the mainstream media, if they're not already, or alternatively, you find that the providers like X, like Facebook, and all the rest of it, are lent on by the government to, if you like, ensure that these views, the views, if you like, of right-wing people, even libertarians, do not get properly aired on their channels. So this is a time which is getting more and more restrictive in terms of freedom. And also when you talk about freedom, I mean, the deployment of technology to identify who you are, where you are, and are you anywhere near a scene of a crime, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All that stuff is just getting more and more intense. I mean, they're now able to identify rioters or people, if you like, part of demonstrations with facial technology and all the rest of it, using drones. They can identify virtually everybody on a march now. So this is something which is getting really very, very intrusive. And, it's very easy to say, well, these Just Stop Oil people, for example, are disrupting our lives. Yes, of course they are. But so if they're disrupting our lives, then they ought to be stopped, sort of thing. Yes, of course they should be stopped. But, the methods by which they are doing it are just completely removing any freedom we have. That, I'm afraid, is now very much the world we live in.
You've pointed on three really important topics there. One is this divide and conquer, these tribal factions that we find ourselves pitted against. And I think it doesn't take much for people to really look at that and say, this is being fomented, this is being sponsored, this is being encouraged, and officially the way that the story is told is automatically creating animosity between people, where we should be realizing, wait, we're all, in this case, we're all Americans, or we're all British, or we're all French, and we love our country and we want things to go better. So it's that what seems to be sponsored breakdown of civility and animosity that plays on our basest instincts of tribalism and factions, and distracting us from the puppeteers who are maybe advancing a broader agenda along the way. Secondly, you mentioned this posturing of taking the high ground by saying whoever can jump on whoever grabs the microphone and says, oh, the others are the extremists, that it's that group that's the extremists, and having this be one-sided, that seems to be a button that's easy to get pushed on our psychic intellectual selves. Is somebody calls someone else an extremist, we automatically think of them as a terrorist or something like that. Like, wait a minute, these people are standing up for something they believe in to be right. When did free speech become a bad thing? As you said, 1984. That's and the third thing was this idea of the always increased control and surveillance. That seems to be always the takeaway. It's like, oh, what we need to do to solve this problem is have more control and more surveillance, and that will solve the problem. So when people say there ought to be a law, be careful what you ask for, because you may not be liking it when it applies against you.
There's also one final thing, and that is that the authorities are now determining what is a conspiracy theory. I mean, the BBC has appointed someone, the British Broadcasting Corporation has appointed someone who is a specialized. His specialization is examining conspiracy theories. And, we know where that's going to go. What is the conspiracy theory? Most of them come out of government. But they will tell us that their conspiracy theories aren't conspiracy theories, but anything you and I say probably is a conspiracy theory. So this is very big brotherish, Orwellian stuff, I'm afraid. Anyway, perhaps we should move on, having made up. Or not.
Well, no, I'm grateful for this. I had no idea that this quick update was going to turn into such a plumbing of this. But I think, frankly, it's very important for us to realize what's being played and what we need to do as ordinary people to trust our guts. Do not let ourselves be dissuaded from what we know and what we sense to be reality by what's being officially announced from the pulpit and from the microphone. I had a close acquaintance I worked with years and years ago, decades ago, in technology, who came from a Middle Eastern country, and he said quite matter of factly, he said, all you need to do to take over a country is, he says, you need to grab the radio station and the palace. Once you have the radio station and the palace, you've got it. And essentially, now we're beyond radio stations, but it's the same principle is at place. If you can determine the predominant message that people are hearing, and you can get people placeholders in the halls of power, you pretty much can guide the fortunes and lives of vast numbers of people. We need to resist that by relying on our intuition and our conscience and our inner voice that tells us what's real. We need to talk to each other and communicate with each other directly as much as possible. I mean, that's partly why we're here as part of independent media, to reach out to our 100,000 plus subscribers all over the country, all over the world, to make sure that we're sharing information in an unbiased way. Thank you for being part of that. And that's very valuable to remember those things.
Can I just add one other thing? Recently, I wrote an article about a Russian defector called Bezmenov, who was interviewed by Ed Griffin, I think in 1984. And he described a psychological operation, which was in 4 parts. But part 1 was basically to indoctrinate students, whereby they would lose all touch, if you like, with common sense, with reality, Now, this indoctrination was in the 1960s. By the time Bezmenov arrived and had defected and was talking to Ed Griffin, he said he was surprised at how successful phase 1 had been. Now, we won't talk about the other phases, but phase 1 basically was getting this brainwashing idea into students. Now, remember that back in the 60s, you had student riots and all the rest of it. In this country, we had sit-ins. In France, they had real riots. I mean, Paris was a battlefield, really. And then you had the Baader-Meinhof gang in Germany. The red. Well, I can't remember what they're called, but that was just slightly after. But you can see how these things were all coincidental. And Bezmenov was making it quite clear that this was something that the KGB basically did through, if you like, useful idiots and all the rest of it. And the interesting thing is that those students are now the elder statesmen in business and also in politics. Their sons, who are imbued with the same disconnect with reality, are increasingly our business leaders and also our politicians. And this is why we have gone woke. I mean, we have just lost all concept of what is right and what is wrong, certainly in the Christian sense, and even just in terms of common sense. I mean, instead of there being 2 genders, there are now, I don't know, 10, 15, whoever you talk to. Our language has we've got to be so careful what we talk about. You can't stand up on the stage and make a joke anymore. This is the end of phase 1 of Bezmenov's description, if you like, of how Russia undermines the morality of the West. And we're seeing it now. We're seeing the fruits of this now. And of course, the other stages will come through, which basically are things like, crisis, revolt, rebellion, takeover by, the new strong men. This is sort of rather Hayekian, if you like, in the sense. And Bezmenov said if they actually think they're going to start running the West, then forget it, they'll be taken out and shot. That was the end game as far as the KGB was concerned. Now, fortunately, Russia fell over, or the Soviet Union rather fell over in the late 1980s. So it spared us phases 2, 3, and 4. But you can see where it's left us. It's left us, toothless as a society, completely disconnected from reality. Whereas the reality now remains in Russia. Which still has a very strong church, still has strong morals. And if you go to Russia, I haven't been to Russia, but I've seen enough footage, if you like, of what life is like in Russia. It's really going very, very well. And particularly since we brought sanctions against Russia. So, if you want to go somewhere with old-fashioned values and you don't care too much about politics, keep your nose out of politics, it's beginning to look like Russia is probably the best place to go. Compared with us, where we have lost all contact with sensibility, really. It's just extraordinary. It is extraordinary. It's a turnaround of everything.
In the midst of that loss of contact with reality, that's why we keep coming back to guests such as yourself to get us grounded again. We've also seen a lot of volatility, not just in demonstrations, that sort of thing. We've seen volatility in the financial markets. Just in the past week, there's been like a 10% drop in the major indices in the U.S. and also internationally. Some people are really concerned about what is happening in Japan, which you've warned us about this no-win situation that the Japanese central bank had backed themselves into for the past year or so. Could you bring us up to date on your view of these most recent volatility in the markets, whether it signals the beginning of the big one or whether this is just going to be volatility as far as the eye can see from this point forward? How are you looking at it, and how should we be considering?
Individual events occur, and you're right, it's difficult really to assess the importance of those events until they play out. But I think by far the most important thing to understand in terms of market valuation is the disconnect between bond yields and equity indices. Usually what happens towards the end of a bull market in equities is that you find that economic conditions are such that interest rates have already started rising, bond yields have already started rising, a tension develops between the valuation of the equity markets and the bond markets. And it sort of pulls apart like that, and then suddenly it snaps. This is, I think, what we're seeing. If you chart the 10-year US Treasury yield, invert it and put it alongside the S&P, you will see that an inverted yield and an S&P generally correlate pretty tightly. There have been exceptions. The first big exception was the dot-com bubble, and in the years following that. The second big one was COVID, where with the suppression of interest rates to the zero bound, the yield on the 10-year US Treasury just collapsed down to less than 1%. The third one, which is the one we're in now, is the biggest disconnect in terms of valuation that we have seen in history. Now, it is closed a little bit with the yield on the 10-year US Treasury coming off a little bit, and at the same time, the S&P 500 itself coming off a little bit. So that gap has closed a little bit, but it is still the largest in history. We are now in a situation where having the S&P having continued to sort of climb while bond yields were climbing, that disparity is so great that the snap is now in place. It's just a question of what triggers it. And what has happened is that the institutions in Japan in particular over many years have sought higher yields abroad by investing in foreign bonds, particularly US Treasuries, and also some of the European bond markets as well. They have also invested quite a lot in US equities. So we have this situation where with the outflows of capital accelerated by the carry trade, as individual institutions in the US and elsewhere would rush out and borrow yen in order to sell the yen to buy dollars and then invest the dollars in T-bills for a yield pickup really of about 5%, leveraged up so that your return on your underlying capital is probably 50% if you leverage it up 10 times. You can see how this thing was taken to excess. And this was why the yen rate against the dollar fell from around about 100 to about 161.5, which was the lowest level for the yen. The numbers are upside down, incidentally. You need to invert the chart. And then everybody got wind, if you like, that the Bank of Japan was going to change its policy and actually raise interest rates from 0.1% to 0.25%. Wow, what a shocker. But what it did was it triggered an avalanche of reversal of the carry trade, as suddenly there were huge losses on the capital side of the carry trade, particularly where people actually hadn't covered for the exchange risk. And at the same time, you were finding that the Japanese pension funds and insurance companies were making, I mean, they were facing quite big losses where they were going out into term debt. And so really what they were doing is they were trying to liquidate their foreign positions as the currency was recovering, because the currency was wiping out any profits that they had or making their bond losses even worse. So they were basically selling dollars, buying yen. And the selling of Japanese institutions' interests came at a very difficult time for the US market, because it was about that time there was some disappointing earnings coming through from, the Magnificent Seven, the top tech companies. And so you had this combination, if you like, which was driving down equities. And it is a crisis. And I think it's very much akin to the crisis that we saw, well, our grandparents saw in 1929. You have the first leg, where there is the panic. The panic subsides, the authorities come in, and in late 1929, the Fed actually did pretty much what it would do today. It went into the market and bought US Treasuries to keep interest rates down. It made reserves available for the commercial banks so that their balance sheets were fine. Now, we do that with QE today. It's quite simple. So they will do the same. They will have to panic and cut interest rates. My guess is after we've seen something like a 30 to 40% fall in the S&P, they will cut interest rates. I can see the meeting, emergency FOMC meeting today. And when that happens, I think markets will steady. This is what happened from around about November 1929 and ran through to around about May to June in 1930. Then the market started its pernicious decline from having rallied about, regained about half the initial fall. You then had this long, pernicious decline down to a low level where the Dow fell, roughly lost 90% or 89% from the top by mid-1932. I won't describe the crises that came with it, like banks failing and all the rest of it. This is the sort of thing which, we can envisage being repeated today. But you can see that the structure of the market, of the bear market, is actually quite clear in advance. We can see this in advance. So to summarize, you've got the initial crash, where everybody throws their toys out of the pram. We all get terribly worried. Banks start worrying about the value of the collateral they've got against loans, all that sort of stuff. The Fed comes in, has to rescue the situation. Calm is restored for a number of months, and then the real decline starts, and it's very pernicious. I mean, we can see that. You can envisage that. There are other factors now which I think could change the timing of everything. And to my mind, the most important thing is the way in which tensions are rising in the Middle East. This, I think, is extremely concerning. It looks to me, when you get countries like America, the UK, France, and so on, telling their citizens, get out of Lebanon, they don't do that because they think there might be some vague risk. They do it when they're pretty certain that war is approaching. And they've also sent, fleets to go and sort of support whoever they're supporting. I mean, let's face it, is Israel. And this is going to bring in Syria. Syria will be attacked. Of that, I have no doubt at all. I would expect Iran to be attacked probably after Iran has had some sort of response to the assassinations. I mean, the assassination of a Hamas leader in Tehran was really a very, very aggressive thing for Israel to do. Though I understand she hasn't actually admitted to doing it. Israel will be fighting for her life and as a nation. And I think that having got to this sort of stage, I see very little alternative. But Iran will be drawn into this. And I'm told that Iran has already mined the Straits of Hormuz and can close them off like that, electronically. So that sort of development, I mean, think what that would do to us. Think what it would do to the oil price. Think what it would do to markets. Think what it would do to gold. These developments are very, very serious and very, very disruptive, and would probably override that schema that I gave of a market which is likely to more or less repeat the course of the 1929 to 1932 mega bear market.
In the face of all of this, people have flown to alternative currencies. I would say about 0.5% of people on average have any investments in, for example, physical precious metals or precious metals related equities, that sort of thing. Others have opted for cryptocurrency, thinking that that's the new version. It's been called the new gold, for example. You've written on that recently and tried to bring some clarity of thought to what the differences are between cryptos versus solid assets. Do you care to elaborate on that for the benefit of our audience? Because people are looking for ways to find shelter in turbulent seas.
Yes, I mean, in fact, I am writing about this in my article for Thursday, which, I mean, this is the 6th of August, Thursday, the 8th of August. It will be released on my Substack. I mean, the point about cryptocurrencies, and particularly Bitcoin, which is seen, if you like, as, the people's money, replacing the state's money, which is fiat currency. The problem with it, there are lots and lots of problems with it, really. In terms of the concept, it's an interesting take, if you like, on the contrast between something which you call a currency, though it's not used much as a currency, which has a limited quantity, a fixed quantity, compared with a fiat currency, which is infinitely expandable at the government's behest. Now, we know that story, and it's a story which is pushed and pushed and pushed. And, anyone sitting down with a computer sort of tries to work out, what's going to be the expansion of, the amount of dollars in circulation, and what's that going to, and you look at it one versus the other, and you come up with a solution. Well, this is going to take Bitcoin to $250,000 or $1 million or $10 million. And people start plucking figures out of midair. So much so that it's extraordinarily widely held. I was looking at some research that was sponsored by the regulator, the financial regulator in this country. At the end of 2023, they reckon that 9% of the adult population of this country held cryptocurrencies. Now, if that's true here, it's true all around Europe. It's certainly true in America. This is very, very widely held. Now, so let's put that on one side. The other thing which is important to note is that in this recent market shakeout, Bitcoin has been immensely weak. I mean, I think in one day it lost something like $5,000 in its value. It's fallen from a high of $71,000, $72,000 to a current level of about 55, having dipped down to 51 and change. So that is a mega, mega downfall for something which is the currency of the future. At the same time, gold's decline has only been 3% from the top. So, but what you want out of a currency is stability. You don't want something that's just going to roar up and up and up and up. Because apart from anything else, it's not the currency that circulates, it's the credit which is created, which relates to the currency or to the money, if you like. Bitcoin is absolutely useless in that respect, because how can you build a factory? How can you do the business calculation to produce goods, which generally takes, you've got to set up the factory, you've got to buy the machinery, you've got to employ the people, you've got to do this, you've got to do that. Let's say, best guess, 5 to 10 years. What's the value of Bitcoin going to be, or credit based on Bitcoin going to be in 5 or 10 years' time? As a businessman, you cannot do the calculation, but you can do it with gold. You can do it also with paper currencies. Paper currencies happens to work in your favor because, you can sort of work out, or you can make an assessment as to what inflation is going to do to values. And that sort of underwrites the whole thing. This is why businessmen like inflation. But, if you're going to have something which theoretically is going to rise in value over the time when you draw down your investment in Bitcoin credit and you have to pay it back, you cannot do the calculation. It is completely useless. And therefore, any idea that Bitcoin will replace fiat currencies, or indeed be a modern equivalent of gold, forget it. If it actually came in, if it was, let us say, turned into into a legal currency by governments, we would go back to the Middle Ages, the pre-industrial revolution, because we would be completely unable to produce anything. So you can forget that. But the fact of the matter is that the price doesn't correlate, if you like, with the idea of its moneyness. It actually correlates with the NASDAQ 100 index. So in other words, what you're seeing is the same cohort of bulls in these high-flying tech stocks are exactly the same people who've bought into Bitcoin. And that, I think, tells the whole story. It's something which is merely a speculation. It is a bubble. It's been a wonderful bubble if you've been sensible enough to take profits somewhere along the line. But for those who have been buying when the ETFs came in, let's say, which is in the last year or so, it's, for a start, they're probably on losses now, and they'll lose a lot. In my view, I think it'll just go belly up, bang, that's it. That's not good news. It's a source of funds for losses which you have elsewhere.
It's been an interesting example of what often gets brought up in terms of new technology, and people say the game is different this time. This time is different because it's not just a bubble. For internet commerce, it was that way. There's been other examples where they say, nope, this is different now. We have to get out of the buggy whip manufacturing stage because now we're into a new world. And people are saying that about AI stocks. People are saying about biotech. They were saying it about. So it's been a very fascinating example of the "this is different" mantra, and time will tell, I guess, as you point out, what the requirements are for money. One is a stable source of value, and you're not seeing that yet exemplified in cryptocurrency.
Yeah, I don't believe you ever will. There is a problem. Cryptocurrencies are not legal tender. there is also a further legal problem, and that is to do with property rights in the case of theft. I don't know whether I've covered this on your show before, but there are basically two different forms of rights. If you've got something which is fungible, which is truly fungible, like credit, for example, or coin, or banknotes, someone steals them from you and goes and spends them in a shop round the corner, you can't have redress against the shopkeeper. You can only have redress against the thief. If, on the other hand, someone steals some of your furniture, or a painting off the wall or whatever, and let's say that it is bought by someone else with whom you have absolutely no connection, the thief has no connection with, and you can identify that property as having been in your possession, then that property, you can claim it back without compensation. This is what Jewish families have been doing against the Nazis. And, we have an example over here. There was a woman, the wife of some very, very rich mid-Asian, I can't remember, it's Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan or something. I mean, we're talking about billions, and she was spending enormous amounts of money, and the courts are repossessing her property. How can the court do that? Well, the court can do that because they are effectively the proceeds of crime. Now, the reason this is important is because every bit of Bitcoin is identified on the blockchain. It is not fungible in the way which credit is. It's not fungible in the way banknotes are. It's not fungible in the way coin is. So you have this problem that because it has been used by the criminal classes for hiding the proceeds of crime, for money laundering and all the rest of it, all it needs, and it can be identified, the ownership can be identified the whole way along the chain, coming to you, particularly if you bought it through an exchange, where you had to provide all the KYC stuff. You could find the feds knocking on your door saying, we have information that leads us to believe Mr. Kaiser, that you own Bitcoin, which we can identify in the blockchain as follows. And you have to give it up. Either that or they take you to jail and throw the key away. This is not the basis for money. It is the basis for property, which may not be, you may possess it, but you don't own it. This is something which I think is immensely important. And the uncertainty over that really means that there's no way it can work as a medium of exchange. Except between consenting parties. If you and I agree to swap Bitcoin for something, that's just down to you and me. But to have this as something, legal tender, it cannot be done legally. That's the point I'm making.
This is a fascinating aspect to the argument I've not heard before. Thank you for bringing that up. It gives us a lot to think about cryptocurrencies being property that's not fungible. Therefore, they can be effectively traced and maybe repossessed. Interesting. People want to follow your work. Where should they get connected, Alasdair?
Well, I have my own Substack, Macleod Finance Substack. It's you probably Google it that way. That's the best way to find it, because otherwise you might not be able to spell my rather Scots name of Alasdair Macleod. I write about precious metals, economics, finance, credit, money, credit, geopolitics, anything really which is fundamental to all our values in that sense. And I try and educate people about the difference, particularly between gold as money and everything else being credit. That is an extremely important lesson. And in these very febrile financial times, if you understand that, it could be a lifesaver.
Well, appreciate you offering that to our viewers. Folks, check it out. We'll put a link to Alasdair's Substack in the description of this video to help you find it. And Alasdair Macleod, always thank you for joining us on behalf of all of our viewers and subscribers. Thanks for being here on Liberty and Finance.
Thank you for having me on, DK.
This is Kaiser Johnson with Liberty and Finance, and these are the Miles Franklin Weekly Specials for August 5th through August 12th, 2024, while supplies last. First, we feature 2024 1-ounce silver American Eagles at $5.50 over spot. Next, we have backdated 1-ounce silver Austrian Philharmonics at just $3.10 over spot. We also have Dealer's Choice Constitutional Silver half dollars at $2.50 over spot per ounce. Next, backdated 1-ounce gold American Buffalo are just $99 over spot. And finally, we have a limited quantity of 1-ounce silver full-color Trump Fight for America bars, just $6 over spot. They come 20 to a sheet, and so have a minimum order of 20 and are sold in multiples of 20. To order our specials or any of the many other options we have available, call us at 1-888-81-LIBERTY. That's 1-888-815-4237. We're available after hours and on weekends, and we look forward to speaking with you.